Good morning, friends. My name is Matt, and I serve as the pastor here. If you would, could you please stand as you're able for the reading of Scripture this morning, which comes from 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 to 7. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see a respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. As we're continuing on in our series in 1 Peter, which we began back in September, we're just rolling on verse by verse through our way through this letter that Peter is writing to people who are believers, they're Christians, they're scattered all throughout the Roman Empire, and they've suffered a great deal, and they're about to suffer even more. And as I've been trying to repeat every week, that the whole idea of this letter, that if you're writing to a group of people who are suffering, who have endured a lot of hardship, who are about to endure even more, what is it that you need to hear in that moment? All right, what pep talk do you need? What motivation, what sermon do you need to hear in a moment of suffering to help you persevere and endure and to get through whatever it is that you're going through? This is what the letter of 1 Peter is about. And a couple of weeks ago, we got to this part in chapter 2 where Peter is starting to work out the gospel into our relationships. He's saying if it is true that God says that you're his chosen and set apart, his priestly people who are exiles in a country that's not your home, and you're just passing through the kingdom of this world that is fading away, how should you live with respect to your relationships to the governing authorities, to your boss or to your master if you're coming to Christ in the first century from the social position of being a slave? How should you relate to the authorities in your life? And in our passage today, Peter is maybe stepping on our toes again and talking about our relationships, particularly between husbands and wives. And I recognize that in a room like this, we're all in different positions in our relationships. Maybe you are newly married and you're loving your life together. Maybe you're recently engaged and you're looking ahead towards married life. Maybe you've been married for a long time and it seems very routine and passé, and in fact, maybe even a little dull and monotonous. Or maybe you're here and you're single and you long to be married, and that isn't something that's happened in your life right now. I recognize that when we come to a passage like this, we come at it from a variety of backgrounds and expectations, a lot of hopes and a lot of hurts in the midst of all of it. And I also recognize that in reading a passage like this, we come to it not just from our life backgrounds, but maybe some of our prejudices or assumptions. In reading a passage like this, maybe there is something that's been triggered in your mind, that this passage seems, at least on the surface, a little chauvinistic, a little patriarchal, a little antiquated. Like, do we really need to apply what Peter is saying here about what a woman wears or how she addresses men in her life? Like, really, even when Peter reaches back thousands of years before his time to the relationship of Abraham and Sarah, is this really a word that we need to hear today? Is this really a word that we need to hear in the midst of suffering and hardship and difficulty? And friends, what I want to encourage us this morning is that before we check out of the sermon because either you're not married or maybe even because you have maybe you view the passage in the way that I've described this morning, don't check out, because I want us to be patient with Peter and look at this passage on his own terms and see what Peter is writing about and writing from his passage. Because I think if we can understand what Peter is saying on his terms and even on Christianity's own terms, we may get a glimpse of something here that's remarkable, right? Something that is beautiful in a way that could both free the men and the women, the husbands and the wives, in a way that our lives become a beautiful testimony and a beautiful witness to the watching world about the beauty of God and the glory of his grace. And so what Peter wants to show us, and I think he's masterful in this, and I'll show you how in just a second. He's brilliant at how he subverts certain aspects and expectations of the Greco-Roman culture into which he's writing. And he also is going to revolutionize and transform those social structures for us in light of the gospel. And so as we work our way through this passage, I want us to navigate with three headers in mind. So the first one is to look at first how the gospel, and this is going to take a lot of work at the start, but to show you how the gospel here, or how Peter is being socially subversive, how he's being socially countercultural in this passage. Secondly, we'll look at Peter's address to wives and women in this passage, and then we'll end by looking at Peter's word for men. So if you're looking for a roadmap, we're going to look at kind of the countercultural nature of the gospel. Secondly, we'll look at Peter's word to wives, and then secondly, Peter's word to husbands. So first, I want us to see that the gospel here is socially countercultural. And if you look at this passage, it actually breaks down really neatly into two sections, not evenly, but neatly. You look at verse 1, you see the word likewise wives, and then in the verse 7, you see the word likewise husbands. So Peter's being very clear-cut in who he's addressing in this passage. It's structured, it's organized. And to us, modern 21st century, highly individualized people, that's kind of unimpressive, right? We're all type A, we're organized. But even say in verse 1, wives, that's in Peter's day, a very radically countercultural move. Now, it's lost in a society of ours, right, where everybody's an individual, everybody has equal rights and independence, and we're all free in our own thinking and morality and culpability. We already assume these things, but back in the New Testament days in the Greco-Roman culture, like it wasn't like today. And here's my point. Because what's unique about the New Testament and the household cultures back then was that slaves and wives and children in that time were never addressed directly, right? Because in Greco-Roman culture, slaves and wives and children weren't considered to be full human beings. We looked at this last week when Aristotle or Epictetus would say things that, slaves are just talking tools. Women are just bodies that are meant to create orderly structure in the home. What we come to in the New Testament, though, is that these people are addressed directly. In Greco-Roman culture, when you have this genre of household codes, or when they talk about slaves and women and children, they're always talking about them through the father, right? Through the pater familias, which is the Roman way of saying the head of the household. So if you wanted to teach wives something, you told the husband. If you wanted to teach children something, you told the father. If you wanted to tell the slave something, you told the master. And in Greco-Roman society, that's all bound up in one person, because in that culture, they're the only ones who are most free. They have the rights and responsibilities of being a citizen in that culture. But what the New Testament does is it addresses the lowly and the weak and the marginalized, the people that everyone else in the culture would have written off. That just as we saw last week when Peter is talking about our working relationships, he addresses slaves, but he doesn't address masters, interestingly. In this passage, he addresses women before he even addresses the men in the passage as well. It seems unimpressive to us, but it's actually a very dignifying fact. It's countercultural, because Peter, in this instance, is saying that women and slaves in this society, you are full human beings. You do have agency. You do have the ability to make decisions. You are a moral actor in the fullest sense in your own right, which is incredibly shocking and countercultural to the readers of his day. And if that doesn't convince you, maybe this added component to the argument will. Look again at verse 1 and verse 7. It starts off with that word likewise, right? And in using that word likewise, Peter is referring to something that he's already said previously. And so you jump back into chapter 2, and I think Peter is drawing us back to chapter 2, verse 18, when he's talking about our working relationships, specifically the relationship between slaves and masters. And again, if that's triggering, we got into it last week. I'd encourage you to go back to our sermons on our website, the podcast. We went into that a little bit more. But when Peter's talking to slaves in verse 18, and he's saying, wives, like in verse 1, husbands in verse 6, when you're looking at what your model is, what your example is for how you're supposed to relate to one another, your example are the slaves, right? Something that was even lower than than Roman women, and children at the time were slaves. Like the kind of paradigm that nobody in the first century would have ever built a system of life or even a religion on. Like Peter is saying, your model for how you're supposed to relate to one another is the lowest of the low. And you look at how the least and the last in a society is meant to relate to those who have the most and the power, and says that is your model. And you see it's not a double standard. He's holding wives and husbands, men and women, to that exact same standard. He's not saying it's one set of rules for women and it's a different set of rules for men. He says all of us are meant to look to the slave for how we're supposed to relate to one another. And what Peter does in that passage as well, he says you're not just supposed to model your life together, the way that you relate to one another, on a slave. He says, look to the true and ultimate slave, right? To the ultimate suffering servant, Jesus, who went and served unjust authorities and was executed by them. And yet, by his sacrifice and death and resurrection, we gain freedom and forgiveness and life in him. That if you're looking for the model of service and relationship, it's found not just in looking to the slaves of the world, but looking to the slave, Jesus, who was executed and resurrected for you. And so if you're here this morning and you're assuming that Christianity is patriarchal or chauvinistic or anti-woman, I hope you're seeing that the gospel is radically countercultural, because it's pointing us to examples in the world that no one else in human history prior to the rise of Christianity would have looked to for a way to live, a way to order our lives, or a way to relate to one another. The gospel levels the playing field and puts men and women on equal footing, and says we're all in need of grace. We're all in need of direction and how to relate to one another. We're all lost when it comes to our relationships. But Peter gives us a way forward. He tells us to look to the slave Jesus who was crucified and resurrected for you. The gospel is radically countercultural in that way. He takes the slave, the lowest of the low, and makes it the paradigm for people to relate to one another. And in this passage specifically, for how husbands and wives are to relate to one another. And so as we think about this and what Peter's saying to wives in verses 1-6, here's what Peter has to say about the beauty of wives in this passage. Now, again, this is a tough passage, and I want the Bible to speak on its own terms. And what I want us to see is that there really is something beautiful and transformative here, something enlightening, something that I think is freeing if we take what Christianity has to offer here. So if you're with me in the passage, I want us to consider the context of what Peter is trying to address here as he's talking to the Christian community. The first thing that the commentators are in almost unanimous agreement about, as I was studying this passage, is that when Peter is talking about this husband-wife situation, they're unanimously agreed that he's talking to Christians who are in mixed faith households. So particularly, it's in this relationship where the wife has become a Christian and the husband is not a believer. The husband is not a Christian. And so you have Peter, who is addressing wives. And again, in the first century, when women aren't viewed as the same status socially as men, you can understand how this becomes a very complicated situation, right? Which I think accounts for why Peter writes 6 verses to women here in this passage and just 1 for men. It's not because men have it all together and they've figured everything out and women really need it spelled out for them. I think Peter is just writing because he recognizes the complexity that the women who are coming to Christ in the first century are under when they're in a social situation where they're expected to worship the same God as their husband. They're expected to obey every command and every order that's given to them. And so for coming to a new faith, a new set of belief, a new Lord over them, the Lord who isn't their husband, but who is the Lord of all, Jesus Christ, it's going to radically transform their relationships. Peter understands the complexity of their situations. And so what he is saying in verses 1-6 are, how do you live your life with an evangelistic framework in mind, where you're trying to win over and convert your non-believing husband? And this is a little bit different than when the Apostle Paul is writing about husbands and wives in Ephesians 5, for instance. Paul is writing what you could say is from a more theological perspective. He's saying when it comes to our relationship to God, it's like Jesus is the groom and we are his bride, and it's a very theological explanation. Peter here is being a lot more practical, and he's using an evangelistic framework. He's saying if you're in a mixed faith household where you're a believer and your husband isn't, here's how you should live. Here's how you should relate to the other person in this relationship so that you can help them find and follow Jesus for themselves. And so before we get into the nitty-gritty and what this passage is saying, I want to just be very clear and explicit as to what this passage isn't saying. And I was really helped by a commentator on this passage named David Helm. And when he's writing in this passage, he's saying that these verses do not mean that you give up Christ because your husband tells you to. It means you don't sin because your husband asks you to. It doesn't mean that you can't have a different opinion and speak up because your husband says be silent. It doesn't say that you have to be silent and listen and agree with everything that your husband says. And it especially doesn't mean that if your husband abuses you in any way, physically or verbally or sexually, that you just have to take it because it's your Christian duty to be submissive to your husband. And that's actually one of the major abuses of this passage when it comes to using this language of husband and wife, saying that if you really want to honor your husband, you just have to submit and be quiet. And what I want to say is that's entirely unbiblical. And it's a sad state of affairs that if you read this verse and if in your lived experience it's been fleshed out in that kind of a way, I just want to say I'm sorry. And if you are experiencing abuse of any kind in a marriage, you don't have to sit under that. That's a lie that you just have to submit and take it. And if you need help, this is why Will mentioned a little bit earlier, we have leaders in our church, a plurality of folks to help come alongside and extricate you from those kinds of situations. And so if you need help, please ask for it. We're here and ready to respond. But that's what those verses don't mean, right? It doesn't mean that women just have to blindly submit and follow every order and just comply with what the men in their lives are telling them to do. And even broadly culturally, this is not just a statement on how women are supposed to relate in relationships. And in the broader society, this what Peter is saying is not binding for all men and all women in every situation. There are different rules of engagement. There are different ways where we relate. So if you're in a workplace and your supervisor is a woman, doesn't mean that that means men, you have to submit to her authority. It's a different relationship. It's a different dynamic. It doesn't mean that that if you're a man, you have a blank check to order the world as you see fit, because again, the gospel counterculturally says we should take the mind of Christ in every single relationship, and it changes the way that we engage. But here's what I think is what Peter is getting at in this situation. Again, remembering that Peter is writing to believing spouses who are living with husbands who aren't believers. And Peter says your first priority, wives, in this situation, the first way you should think about life is to not prioritize your external beauty, but to prioritize your internal beauty, your character, right? Don't so much prioritize in trying to change your husband or to change your appearance. Focus primarily and firstly on your character, and let your character be the thing that speaks louder than anything else in your relationship. You see, it's not primarily about braiding hair or jewelry. What Peter, I think, is touching on here is in that cultural context. If women braided their hair, wore jewelry or other clothing, sort of as a way to say that they have a little bit of a rebellious streak. They're not entirely submissive to their own husbands, or trying to express their own individuality. I don't think Peter is trying to police what women are wearing or doing in their context. I think he's getting to the harder motivation of, don't try to flaunt or go over the line to try and, don't take worldly measures to try to convert your husband or to undercut his authority, but let your character be the thing that persuades him at the end of the day. And the point that Peter is trying to make for wives is that, you want to win your non-Christian husband over. You do it not by bringing dishonor by rebelling against his authority, but by paying attention to your character and your conduct. Right? Read verses 1-2 with me again. He says, "Be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives when they see your respectful and pure conduct." And then in verses 3-4, he says, "Don't let your adorning, your beautifying, right, your adorning be external, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious." You see, in that word adornment, in the most biblical sense, means, having, it's like the root word of kind of having an orderly arrangement, Like what Peter is trying to say is that you have to take this idea of decorating, right? This idea of adornment, and order yourself, not just in your physical appearance, but true beauty comes when you have an orderly arrangement of the heart internally. And in Peter's framework, this is loving God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself. And that's why when Peter says, when you really want to win your husband over to Christ, like don't just have an external adornment, but have a rightly ordered arrangement of your heart, right? Order up your heart with the virtues of patience, of love, of being gracious. Right? When Peter says it's to have a gentle and quiet spirit, it's a spirit that's self-assured. It's not looking to other people for validation. It's resting in Jesus. It's looking to him. It's having a rootedness in Christ. And that's what Peter's trying to tell us. That's what real beauty is all about. Right? In our day and age, like I don't have to make the case that our culture is one that prioritizes external beauty, right? Our feeds are so saturated with physical beauty. It's like a major leg of our economy, that you have to look younger, you have to look thinner, you have to join this gym, you have to have this diet regimen. It's all about physical beauty. But what Peter's trying to tell us is that true beauty for wise Christians is to have inner beauty. And for all of us, that means not just for wives, but for us, that when it comes to the inner character of our hearts, it means that we have to be more concerned about being interior decorators than exterior decorators, right? It's like maybe you're you've been playing the real estate game and you see a home that has good curb appeal, but bad bones, right? Like it looks good from the street, but you get inside and the walls are falling down, and there's mold, and it's just going to take a lot of investment to rehabilitate. Like you probably want a home that looks a little bit worse on the outside if the bones on the inside are good. Like Peter's saying, be more concerned about your internal design than your external design. And for wives and for you and me as Christians, Peter's saying, when he's saying be subject to your husband, it's not talking about you can't have your own opinion. It's not talking about you can't make decisions together. It doesn't even mean that your husband is your Lord over you, because we both have, husbands and wives have the same Lord, right? They have the same master, Jesus. He's saying, order your heart around the internal beauty of Christ and the gospel, and let that be the thing that in your relationship with your husband speaks loudest. Let the beauty of your life come from internal adornment and beauty. And so if that's what Peter is talking about when it comes to wives, here's what he's trying to say to husbands in verse 7. And again, there's much more that I could say. Like I'm haven't even touched on some of these things. I'm contemplating doing like a +1 or a podcast about it, because I don't want to preach too long about it. But I also don't want to be that guy who also starts up a podcast. So maybe just talk to me afterward and I can clarify it. But see what Peter is saying to husbands here in verse 7. And he's saying, men, likewise husbands, right, putting them on the same standard, holding them at the same level as everyone else. He says, show honor to the woman, to your wife, so that because you are both equally heirs of grace, right, you're the same status, and so that your prayers may not be hindered. And so notice, especially for the husbands, Peter doesn't say, husbands, lead, right? He doesn't say, husbands, use your authority. He says, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way. He says, husbands, the word that Peter is using is not the typical word that we would read with like live with or submission. It has this connotation of being intimate with. Have an intimate understanding of your wives. Live with them in such an intentional and mindful way that not just their likes and dislikes, but their loves and their motivations and their emotions and their intentions. You see, know your wife to the best of your ability. You see, he's saying, husbands should not just marry their wife and say, I've graduated the relationship game. It's a marriage is the beginning of a new education process where you are in the science and study of your wife. And you should not content with just getting the bachelor's degree on your marriage certificate. Work towards the master's and the PhD of knowing your wife in the relationship. And the kind of living with that Peter is calling us to is a kind of headship and leadership that looks, again, like what Paul is painting out in the theological understanding of marriage in Ephesians 5. It's a kind of leadership and headship that lays down your life and your preferences and your needs for the sake of the other. That in the same way that Jesus did not count his own equality or his own needs something to be grasped or held onto, he laid himself down and gave himself up so that his spouse, his bride, you and me, could be holy and cleansed and made new and have everything that we need for life and holiness with God. Peter says, live with your wives, walk together, right? Don't just perform marriage, live marriage, understand her heart. And friends, let me end on this. It's just a word to the husbands in this church. When it comes to marriage, it seems like, the conversations oftentimes can just boil down to the logistics, right? Like Thanksgiving is coming up, like which parents are we going to? How are we going to balance the in-laws? Christmas is coming up. How do we break down gifts for all the parents and in-laws and nieces and nephews and things like that? How are we doing with our budget, right? Like, the longer I think you're in marriage, the more that conversations just tend toward the logistical and just the get things done, practicality nature of life. Now, like, those are important, right? And if those fell apart, like, marriages are gonna look rough when all the practicalities and logistics start to get gummed up. But when the Bible talks about husband and leadership, it kind of goes out of its way to emphasize like spiritual leadership. So brothers in the room, fellow husbands, this is the real burden for us, is to take this privilege to lead and to put a priority in our lives, in our marriage relationships with our kids, this idea of spiritual headship, knowing what biblical gospel-centered leadership looks like, because we want to be leading the people under our roof to Christ, right? The most immediate mission field in our families is firstly our spouse, and then it's our kids. And so what that means for us is that husbands, we have to pray more. It means we have to pray harder. And are we leading our family and our wife to Jesus? Are we leading our kids in times where they can learn about Jesus? And are we following Jesus ourselves? Are we reading the Bible? Are we praying? Are we cultivating a deep and intimate and personal relationship with Jesus himself? Because if you're not, like, why in the world are we talking about the budget and vacation and in-laws and all that, which are very important, but the primary way to lead is through spiritual leadership. And I'm just going to admit, like, I'm talking to myself in the midst of all of this as well. Like, I do not have it all figured out. Like, I'm in the same boat. I'm just as lazy. I'm just as self-concentrated and self-centered as anyone else in this room. All right, this is a word that goes out to all of us. Winston Smith, who was a counselor at an organization called CCEF, he wrote a booklet about marriage, which he entitled "Who Does the Dishes?" Right? Maybe that's the burning question in your house. Who does the dishes? And this is what he says is the paradigm. He says, no matter how marital roles are defined, right, at the end of the day, they all boil down to being different expressions of love. And so he says, by the way, the answer is this: it doesn't matter who does the dishes, husbands or wives. It doesn't matter what you do, because the point is not what you do, but that whatever you do in your relationship, you do as an expression of love. All right, the most important question when it comes to gender roles or to husbands and wives is not what am I allowed to do, right? What is my function? The most important question between husbands and wives is, am I expressing love to my spouse? Am I expressing love to my spouse? And the power and the paradigm to do all of this comes from the ultimate servant-slave that we've talked about, the husband of the church, Jesus Christ, who put his bride's priorities and brokenness ahead of his own so that he came into this world to die upon the cross, that he took on the sin of his broken bride, the church. He took on our debt, and he paid that sin upon himself to give the church forgiveness, to reconcile us, to justify us, to make us holy and pure and blameless, to give us the power of the gospel to proclaim the excellencies of who Jesus Christ is for us. And as difficult as this is for both husbands and wives, we have every resource and power in the gospel of Christ, that Jesus, who is our paradigm, gives us this entirely countercultural ethic to go and live as people who can turn the world upside down through the way that we love one another. Can we do that, friends? I pray that we can. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, I pray that you would help us, before we even talk about the logistics of how we live this out, to see and behold Jesus, the author and the perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him laid down his life, who submitted himself to your will for our sakes, so that we might be made holy and pure and blameless. And Lord, as we navigate our own relationships, for those of us in this room who are married, as we navigate our marriages, Lord, that you would give us the mind of Christ, that we might seek and serve and love one another as you have loved us, and that through the conduct of our lives, through the orderly arrangement and adornment of our hearts and souls, that we might see others blown away and come to saving faith in this Jesus who has changed our lives. We ask this in Christ's perfect and precious name. Amen.